Osam Nutalyacha. Welcome. You have joined the Forest Practices Board webinar, Improving Forest Practices to Protect Water. For those of you who don't know the board, we are the public's independent watchdog for sound forest practices and range practices in BC. We have been around since 1995, and we conduct independent audits and investigations of compliance with the Forest and Range Practices Act and report our findings to the public. One of our programs is special reporting, where we examine regional or provincial forest and range practice issues of importance to the public. This special report looked back at 38 of our audit and investigation reports published in the past 15 years that involved forestry and water concerns. I will be moderating today's event. My name is Sky, and I'm the Executive Operations Coordinator for the Forest Practices Board. I'm hosting this webinar from the ancestral lands of Kosamsam and Lekwungen families, now known as the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples. As a guest, I recognize the importance of their historic relationship with the land that continues to this day. In a moment, I will introduce you to our panelists. First, I would like to briefly run through the flow of today's webinar. The format for today's event will be about a half-hour presentation, followed by a half-hour available for questions and answer. Attendees, you have all entered this webinar in listen-only mode. This means that you are muted and the speakers cannot hear you. Please use the chat function to pose questions you would like our panelists to address in the question and answer portion of the webinar. We may not get to all of your questions, but my co-moderators, Darlene Oman and Sean Curry, will do their best to pick out those questions that best bring forward new or clarifying information. As the webinar ends today, you'll see a brief survey that we would appreciate your feedback on. Let's get started with improving forest practices to protect water. Your presenters today are Kevin Creese and Tracy Andrews. Kevin is the chair of the Forest Practices Board. He is working on Wet'suwet'en territory at Smithers. And Tracy Andrews, RPF, is broadcasting from the territory of the Yukon.
Thank you, Sky, and thank you everybody for joining. As Sky mentioned, I'm the chair of the board. I'm Kevin, and I'll be co-presenting with Tracy. So I'm going to start, and then I'll turn it over to Tracy. Next slide, Tracy. First, we'll talk a little bit about the Forest Practices Board, and then we're going to give you an overview of water, climate change, and forest practices and how they interact. And then we're going to get into the meat of the report, which I will share with Tracy, and talk about the 4 opportunities that we've identified where we believe we can improve forest practices and reduce the impacts forest practices can have on water. Next slide. So before we dive in, just a reminder, many of you are attending because you're aware of the board, but we just give you a bit of an update and reminder of who we are. As Sky mentioned, the board's been around for about 26 years. It's made up of 6 appointed board members, one including myself as the chair. And these are board members appointed from across the province who are widely very experienced and have significant strategic abilities in forest management or resource management. And we also have 17 professional staff. These are foresters, biologists, we have an engineer, professional administrative staff, communication staff, and these are essentially the staff who do the work on the ground. So that's who the board is. What the board does is established in legislation under the Forest and Range Practices Act. We have a couple major functions that we have to do every year, one of which is to conduct audits of licensee compliance. Many of you will be familiar with compliance audits as they come across the province. You'll see a news release saying an auditor team is coming to look at licensee compliance. Major part of what we do. The second part is we have a mandate to investigate complaints by the public where they may have concerns about compliance by industry with the legal requirements under FERPA or about enforcement by the province around FERPA or the Wildfire Act. The third part of our mandate, though, is what we call special projects. We have the power to basically undertake investigations or special reports that look at systemic issues around forest and range practices. This is often where we look province-wide, or we may look at a broader issue than an individual complaint or an individual audit. And this report is based on one of those projects and also draws on previous reports coming out of our special projects programs. And finally, a little less known part of our work is we do have the ability to undertake appeals to the Forest Appeals Commission where there is a decision that has a public interest where someone believes it wasn't an appropriate decision, and we can appeal those to the Forest Appeals Commission. So that's a little bit about who we are, and we'll be drawing from all of that various work in terms of how we've developed this particular report around water. So next slide. So part of the question is why this report at this time? The public has a lot of concerns about water and the impact of forestry. Water issues and concerns around water make up about 1/3 of the complaints that we receive from the public. So we know it's an issue of major public concern. At the same time, last year about this, just after the new government was elected, it indicated its intention to create a watershed security strategy and fund. And we felt that that created an opportunity for us to help identify what we've seen happening with respect to forestry and the potential impacts that forestry can have on water and identify some improvements. So basically this report helps identify what we call or consider the forestry meat on the watershed security strategy bones. People may have seen that the province released a discussion paper in January around the watershed security strategy, and there is a public review and comment period on that initial phase of that strategy open until March. So back to, we hope that this helps inform the development of that watershed security strategy. Second is the province has been developing a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy for a couple of years. As we'll talk about in a little bit, we know that forestry and climate change can interact, sometimes negatively. And we also know that forestry and the practices we use can help adapt to a changing climate, including adapt to some of the impacts we see on water. So again, we feel that some of the strategies we're identifying here and some of the recommendations that we make can help inform a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy in BC for the forestry component. And then finally, the province is in the midst of modernizing its forestry legislation. We've seen 2 rounds of changes to the actual legislation itself. And we know that we're still moving into further regulatory change that will happen over the next couple of years. So we believe that some of these opportunities we've identified can help inform and implement the modernization of forestry legislation. So that's why this report is intended to essentially inform all 3 of those strategies that are underway in the province. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy, who's going to talk a little bit more about the report itself.
Thanks, Kevin. So as Kevin mentioned, this is a special report and it's based upon past work of the board. I just want to note that we did not carry out any new investigative work for this project. So strictly looked at the past reports and tried to tease out the underlying issues that remained unresolved at the end of our investigations. So the 27 complaints, quite a bit of information coming from our special investigations, and a note that we did have 3 compliance audits with specific findings on water, although we've done a lot more audits than that in the last 15 years. So we all know that in the future, BC is expected to experience changes in our climate, and we are expecting stream flow patterns to change as a result of that. We also know that different regions of the province will experience different climate impacts. So we can't control how much rain is going to fall or how warm the temperatures are going to get in the spring, but we can control how we manage our forests to adapt to these changing conditions. So forest practices can also cause changes in stream flow patterns. One example of how forest practices can compound impacts from climate change is rain on snow events. So removal of forest cover from harvesting results in greater snow accumulation on the ground. If that's followed by heavy rain, the result is an increased risk of flooding. There's many other potential negative impacts, and they're different in different places around the province. The point is that we have a chance to reduce the potential for those negative impacts by proactively managing for it now. The board believes that climate change needs to be considered in all of our forest practices. The 4 opportunities identified in this report are based on our past experience and can all contribute to climate change adaptation. So the Forest and Range Practices Act governs forest practices on public land in BC. And using the legal tools in FERPA is the only way that government can require licensees to do certain things. Licensees must address these requirements in their on-the-ground practices. FERPA already contains quite a few legal requirements to manage impacts on water. Some examples of those are riparian area management and practice requirements surrounding certain practices on roads. And in our experience, those requirements are generally well managed by licensees. However, these are mostly site level requirements and they do not manage for impacts at a watershed level. There are watershed level objectives in place currently, but the effective area is quite small, as you'll see in the next slides. So this report describes the issues that need to be addressed to improve outcomes for water and the opportunities that are available for government to implement changes to planning and practices. So to give us some context, currently about 9% of the province has an objective that requires management of cumulative effects at a watershed level. Most of these areas come from land use objectives, such as the Great Bear Rainforest. 3% of the area of BC has been designated as fishery-sensitive watersheds under the Government Actions Regulation. If you examine the fishery-sensitive watershed orders, they often have several objectives addressing elements such as sediment delivery, stream crossings, active fluvial units, rate of cut, and equivalent clear-cut area at a basin or sub-basin scale. And finally, we have about 1% of the area of BC is designated as community watersheds, and that's occurred under the Forest Planning and Practices Regulation, and most of these were grandparented from the Forest Practices Code. So the objective for community watersheds is to prevent the cumulative hydrologic effects of primary forest activities from resulting in material adverse impact on the quantity of water or the timing of flow of water, or from having a material adverse impact on human health that can't be addressed by water treatment. This objective applies only to the extent that it does not unduly reduce the supply of timber. So based on our past work, we identified the 4 most common issues with forest practices and water. And for each of those issues, we identified an opportunity for improvement. The 4 issues the report outlines are public involvement, cumulative effects, sediment from roads, and watershed restoration. So as Kevin mentioned already, about 1/3 of our public complaints that the boards received have been about water, whether that's harvesting in community watersheds or domestic watersheds or near other water resources. The public want more involvement in how water is considered in forest practices on the ground. So when water is not a value considered in a planning process, then the public does not have opportunity for input or involvement into how that value is managed. Strategic planning primarily occurred in the 90s when most land use plans were developed. The public was involved in those processes. In some of these areas, legal objectives followed, and in few of those legal orders, watershed level objectives were established. Most of those plans and legal orders have not changed since then. Recently, modernized land use planning has been reinvigorated in specific areas to address specific values. We also know that Water Sustainability Act planning, which is often being done as part of modernized land use planning, is happening in localized areas. So those strategic planning processes can influence forest practices in those areas, including direction for managing water. Operational planning is being done by forest licensees to address established objectives. As we saw on the slide earlier, only about 9% of BC has watershed level objectives for water. Licensees only have to engage the public on plans that address established objectives for a value, such as water. Therefore, in most watersheds, there is no mechanism to involve the public regarding how forest practices consider watershed level effects on downstream values at risk. Site level planning for blocks and roads is carried out by licensees as well. There is no legal requirement currently to engage the public in site level planning. although many licensees are trying to engage the public at that level voluntarily. When recent FERPA amendments are put into force, the requirement for public review and comment on a forest operations map will create new opportunity for public involvement on the location of planned blocks and roads. So while this is constructive, the board believes that public engagement on water is needed at a watershed level and before planning and investment has been made. That's why the board believes that forest landscape planning, the new planning level in BC, is the ideal opportunity for robust public involvement in forest planning. Forest landscape plans must consider the values placed on forest ecosystems by Indigenous peoples and by local communities, and there will be public review and comment processes for forest landscape plans. However, it's not an explicit requirement to manage for water in a forest landscape plan. The board believes that water must be a core value in forest planning processes. Planning processes consider a range of inputs, such as the results of cumulative effects assessments, climate projections, legal requirements, as well as interests of Indigenous peoples and the public. The outcome of forest planning is a plan that sets out what values will be managed and what outcomes are desired. But in addition to that, planning processes result in an improved understanding of the intent behind the plan and stronger relationships amongst those tasked with implementing it. All of this leads to improved forest practices on the ground. So we now understand that water has been raised as a value of importance in a couple of the current forest landscape planning pilots, and we believe this is a really important step. Forest landscape planning presents an opportunity to set outcomes or planning guidelines that address risk to water, influenced by local communities involved in the planning process. The public would have an opportunity to comment on these outcomes and planning guidelines, all of which will be considered by the Chief Forester in approving a forest landscape plan. Outcomes or planning guidelines must be addressed in licensees' forest operations plans, and those are the direct link to forest practices on the ground. So the second opportunity, it's well documented that forestry can result in cumulative effects on water. As discussed earlier, climate change effects are likely to compound any negative effects arising from forestry. And there is no legal requirement to assess or consider cumulative effects of forest practices in most watersheds in BC. Some licensees manage cumulative effects on a voluntary basis and should be credited when they do, but what the board has found is that is not the norm. The report describes how progress is being made assessing cumulative effects in provincial programs, which is often being done in collaboration with Indigenous nations. However, without a legal requirement to consider cumulative effects, there is no link to decisions made under FERPA. In BC, we have well understood methods to assess and manage for the potential cumulative effects of forestry on water. In the report, we provide more detail on these methods and where they're being applied. So this slide is just a picture that shows how all these factors can interact in a watershed. It's important to acknowledge that natural processes like fire can be major drivers of cumulative effects. We also know that non-forestry developments can have impacts. It is critical that forest managers do their homework and make informed decisions about risks to values. Kevin's going to talk for a minute and just about an example, a recent example that the board published.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, this slide is an excellent summary of the issues we found in a complaint investigation in what's known as the Silver Hills area near Lumbee, where local residents were concerned about the harvesting in the area upslope of their private property and believed that it had caused landslides near the Shuswap River. What we found was that salvage logging following a fire, so this picture is really good because it shows a fire, and we know that following fire you often see salvage, and it's necessary to get back any economic value. So salvage logging followed a fire, and the result was equivalent clear-cut areas that were quite high, in this case about 43% on a plateau above the harvested, in the top ends of the watersheds. What we also found was that the licensees were compliant in their operations. They met all of the legal requirements of FERPA, and in fact, they had gone beyond by undertaking terrain stability assessments to ensure that their operations on the actual blocks didn't cause impacts to terrain right immediately adjacent to the blocks. So at the end of the report, we were not able to conclude that the licensee's operations contributed to the landslides. There were many natural factors, including the impact of the wildfire itself and the terrain and all the kind of typical things you'll see in a landslide, such as elevated rain and water levels. But we also found that the licensee could have done more. Because those equivalent clear-cut area values were so high, there's a strong possibility that harvesting could have exacerbated the existing cumulative effects in that watershed. And what we found was the licensee had not done a watershed assessment and therefore had missed the chance to proactively identify what the impacts might be before harvesting took place, and then to see whether or not there were any mitigation options which could have occurred to try and reduce the impacts that we eventually saw. So we saw this as a really good example of where the current legal framework doesn't require it, but it was an opportunity missed to do better.
Thanks, Kevin. So earlier, we talked about how there are various ways to assess cumulative effects. One of those is a watershed assessment that Kevin just mentioned. So a watershed assessment is a type of assessment that's commonly used to ensure that forest practices will be compliant with watershed level objectives. Watershed assessments are completed by qualified professionals to identify and analyze hydrologic and geomorphic processes in a watershed. The board previously pointed out weaknesses in how watershed assessments were conducted. And in response to that, in January of 2020, the Joint Practices Board of the Association of BC Forest Professionals and the Engineers and Geoscientists of BC published the Professional Guidelines, Watershed Assessment and Management of Hydrologic and Geomorphic Risk in the Forest Sector. These guidelines are now enforceable practice standards under the Professional Governance Act. The guidelines explain how specialists undertake watershed assessments, which is familiar to many of you, as forest managers have been doing some form of watershed assessment for decades. The guidelines also explain how professionals develop a risk management framework for managing hydrologic and geomorphic risks in watersheds. So, developing a risk management framework and completing watershed assessments are only a legal requirement for a licensee if they are committed to an approved forest stewardship plan as a means of addressing established watershed level objectives. As we discussed earlier, there are watershed level objectives in place for 9% of the province. When government clearly describes what are the desired outcomes in the form of a legal objective, then the licensee must address those objectives, and they must use a qualified professional in the process. Without the what set out as a legal requirement under FPB, licensees maintain discretion on whether or not to assess and manage for risk to water and what amount of risk is acceptable. We cannot rely on voluntary action by licensees or on the professional guidelines alone to ensure that cumulative effects to water are managed everywhere. The board believes it's important for government to clearly state what must be managed. In the case of water, that is management of cumulative effects of forest practices throughout the province. In addition, it is important for government to provide direction on how much risk is acceptable. If government takes that step, the professional guidelines are brought into play across the province. The report suggests that government could take a risk-based approach to managing cumulative effects. And we see as a good example, the professional guidelines describe a risk-based management framework. So the level of management increases as the level of risk increases.
Great, thanks, Tracy. So I'm going to introduce and talk about our next two opportunities. And opportunity number 3 is about sediment coming to streams from roads. So we know from our work that current forest practices do contribute sediment to streams. And the board has identified sedimentation specifically from roads as a problem across much of BC. We also have identified gaps in the current FPB regulations that are related to sediment that allow that sediment contribution to occur. Often what we see in our work is that the practices on the ground are compliant. They meet the requirements of FPB, but they still result in sediment being delivered to streams. Now, as a way of background, the board is aware that sediment is a naturally occurring substance, and we are not advocating a zero sediment or zero risk approach. However, there's clear and substantial evidence that adding more sediment to streams above that which occurs naturally has negative effects. Sediment at the wrong time of the year reduces fish survival. Too much sediment can change stream channel condition, and sediment erodes drinking water quality. But probably more importantly, or as importantly, we know that there are feasible methods to reduce the amount of sediment that is being contributed to streams from roads. This isn't something we don't know how to solve. The next slide may be familiar to some of you who tuned in to our webinar on our fish report about 18 months ago, and basically summarizes part of the results of a 2020 special investigation into fish habitat. I want to remind the readers that report found consistently good practices for riparian management in BC and for stream crossings and maintaining fish passage at stream crossings. But it also found consistently high risk to fish habitat due to sediment from roads. So what you'll see in the slide here is we looked at 5 case study watersheds. And in 3 of those 5 case study watersheds, we found a high level of risk being posed to fish habitat due to sediment from roads. In the 4th watershed, there was a moderate risk. And interestingly, in one of the watersheds, we found a low risk. And what we think that points us to is the fact that we know how to do better. We have practices that can be demonstrated on the ground to improve and reduce risk around sediment from roads. In this particular report, the investigators looked at 200 sites on the ground, and 50 of those sites were identified as a sediment source. And at 37 of those 50 sites, sediment was impacting or had the potential to impact fish habitat. Now, given how many roads and crossings exist in BC, that's too many. We know we have somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 kilometers of roads. So if you're entertaining basically high risk to sediment delivery in a quarter of those roads or those crossings, that's a lot of sediment. Next slide is going to summarize information from the ministry's Forest and Range Evaluation Program. They have one of their protocols is known as the Water Quality Effectiveness Evaluation. This is particularly useful for illustrating and finding the risks that crossings are facing with respect to sediment. In this slide, we summarize the results of about 8,411 samples that were sampled over a period of time, and found that 30% of those 8,411 sites had a moderate or higher potential for sediment generation. So might say, well, what does that mean to have a moderate or higher possibility of sediment generation? Well, a moderate site is where the fine sediment volume has the potential for greater than 1 cubic meter per year at that crossing. 1 cubic meter is a lot of sediment. A site that's rated high has the potential for generating between 5 and 20 cubic meters per year of sediment, and a very high site has the potential for greater than 20 cubic meters of sediment. So if you do the math on that, and again, you add this up from a cumulative effects perspective, you can have a lot of crossings generating, moderate to high amounts, and the collective response in a watershed is a significant amount of sediment that can be generated to our streams. The next slide is just going to show people a little bit about some of the kind of practices that are out there that are legal, but which contribute sediment to streams. The upper slide on the left is a good example of a bridge deck where sediment is falling off the trucks and landing on the bridge deck, and eventually, if this bridge deck is not cleaned and properly maintained, will make its way over into the stream below, which is a fish stream. And the 2 pictures lower down show how that's happening in real time, where again, a bridge deck, in this case during a rain event, is accumulating rain, and the accumulated sediment is now going over the bridge deck into a fish stream, and it's quite turbid. So you're clearly adding sediment to that stream that would not have been natural. The next slide is a couple other examples of the kind of things that you can see, and the top slide is an example of where road deactivation has not been well done, There isn't proper mechanisms to prevent or catch sediment in the sense of very little revegetation and so on. And you can clearly see in the upper slide the amount of sediment that's being caught and deposited and will eventually make its way into the stream. On the lower left side is a little bit less obvious example, but you can see below the person standing that there is a small gully being created where water is accumulating just before a bridge deck, probably during heavy rains, and is slowly eroding that road surface and carrying fine sediments down off the road surface. And this is right next to a stream, and therefore some of that sediment is very likely to enter that stream and then go into a fish stream. The photo on the right, though, is a better example, and we wanted to include it because it shows some innovative practices on how we can actually address these issues. So what you see here is a bridge deck that has had a grate installed at the beginning, and the grate essentially allows sediment to be trapped and caught before it goes on to the road deck, and that can eventually be cleaned and does not enter the stream. So this is a good example of what we know can be done. We know we have particular practices and particular tools that can reduce sediment. The next slide is a little bit of picture of what we call the regulatory gap. There are many provisions in FERPA that partially address the requirements to reduce sediment. So things like requirements to revegetate roads following construction, works in and about a stream, and so on. However, what we found in our report is that there is no requirement to minimize sediment through the life cycle of a road. In particular, roads are in its maintenance phase for a very long period of time, and there's a number of activities everywhere from whether or not you clean bridge decks to how you grade your roads and how you maintain culverts and all those things, which if collectively aren't done well, can contribute to sediment. So what we found is there is a regulatory gap in FERPA that allows some of those practices that we saw in the preceding slides to be legal. So we made, at the end of this report, several recommendations. Two were directed at government. The biggest one, the first one, was to upgrade and improve the guidance that they give in policy to people who are building, maintaining, constructing roads around how the practices are necessary to reduce sediment. And the province has accepted that, and there's work underway to update the engineering manual and other guidance documents from the province. So that's very positive. Secondly, is we recommended that the legislative gap that we've identified be fixed, that we think there are some very pragmatic changes that could be undertaken through the forest planning and practices regulation that would fill that regulatory gap. The province has also accepted in principle that recommendation, has committed to doing work to identify potential solutions. However, we haven't yet seen the results of that, and part of what this report is recommending is please act on the results of that assessment that government staff are undertaking and actually implement the regulatory changes. The last thing I want to add is on this one, we've also noted that a real important part of improving sediment is getting best practices down to those who are out in the field, either locating roads, managing roads, and even to machine operators who are constructing roads. So there is some excellent guidance available. There's training through FP Innovations, and we really encourage anyone who is interested and believes you need to do a better job of managing sediment is to look at the professional training opportunities that are out there, because there's a lot of things that we can do to improve on the ground practices now. So that's a summary of what we believe is the opportunity to improve sediment. And I'm going to talk next about opportunity 4, which is around watershed restoration. So in BC, we know that from our work and from other places that other people who are working on the land base, we know that historic forest practices continue to negatively affect water. And by historic practices, we mean logging and road construction that occurred before the Forest Practices Code was introduced in 1995. We specifically placed watershed restoration as the 4th opportunity in this report because you should really focus on preventing harm from current activities before we go out to fix legacy issues. And the first 3 opportunities are about preventing harm from current activities. However, in BC, we have to face that we have a remaining unfortunate legacy from previous practices. And despite the efforts of many programs over many years, including the old watershed restoration days, and more recently the Healthy Watersheds initiatives, the watershed, the legacy of historic practices has not been fully addressed. It's different in different parts of the province depending on when and how harvesting occurred, but we can see places in the province where there is a legacy of historic practices. So the next slide will just give a sample of some of the kind of historic issues that are out there. The top slide is a classic logging and road construction on very steep slopes, the kind of practices we would not see today with new practices on road construction and full bench cuts and so on, but they're still out there. And some of those continue to have landslides or landslide potential, and some of those historic landslides are continuing to contribute sediment into streams. So that's one. The lower photo is an example of, again, a practice that is not likely to be allowed today, which is harvesting right to the banks of large streams. We now have riparian management area requirements which would prevent immediate harvesting to these larger streams. And the result of that harvesting next to streams was loss of the kind of forest cover that's needed often to maintain the inputs to streams for fish habitat, stream legacies such as large woody debris, shade, and so on. And so there are places where those riparian areas are still damaged and not fully functioning. Last slide around restoration really summarizes what we see as some of the key issues or key areas for opportunities for restoration activities. As we mentioned, some are around improving riparian area condition. There are specific activities that can be taken to restabilize banks, to reintroduce vegetation, and to actually rechannel and recreate eroded fish streams or where fish streams are not properly functioning. There's also the landslides part that we mentioned. You can, in some cases, effectively rehabilitate landslides. It's not easy, shouldn't be done everywhere, but there are some that can be restored. And you can also go and deal with legacies where there may be legacy roads that have not been properly put to bed that still have a risk of creating landslides. For example, if there are culverts that may eventually become plugged and lead to washouts and potentially lead to landslides, those can also be repaired and be put to bed properly. And finally, there are a number of roads in BC, somewhere around 100,000 kilometers, maybe more, of non-status roads that have no responsibility for maintenance and may be contributing sediment from those roads into streams. And those are an opportunity to go and essentially restore them, put them into a condition where they reduce the sediment impact. So there's a number of opportunities available for watershed restoration. And my last thing I want to say is a real shout out. We have seen examples where local organizations, community organizations, and sometimes supported by major forest licensees or with the help of the rest of the forestry community are doing these watershed restoration activities across the province. And we think that's a real valuable contribution to those of you who are participating in that. It's good work. So that is going to lead us to a summary. Basically, just want to reiterate that despite all the good parts of our FERPA legislation with respect to managing water, and there are many, I mentioned how we have generally good practices around riparian and so on, we do have practices today that can and are impacting water. Secondly, is if you look ahead, the anticipated changes in climate from our changing climate are likely to compound the impacts that we may be seeing from our current forest practices. And we need to do what we can to try and better manage our forests to adapt to that changing climate. We also know that there are a number of steps we can take that can be done to manage these impacts, particularly when planning and implementing our forest practices. We can do better. And we know that the opportunities that we've identified are practical. We know how to do them. They simply aren't being done province-wide, and they are not being done at a scale that we need to do. So we think these are practical opportunities, and if these 4 opportunities are seized and acted upon, then we can have a significant benefit and reduce the impacts of water or of forest practices on our water resources. And that concludes our presentation.
Thanks, Kevin and Tracy. I'm going to move us on to the question and answer portion of our work here today. We've seen a bunch of good questions come in that questions and chat section there, so thanks for everyone that's participating on that. As Darlene and Sean comb through those and send me forward the ones that they think we can best address. I'm going to start with an early question we received by email. This question is, the Forest Practices Board has identified 4 areas that need improvement to protect water. How will these measures that have been identified be enforced to ensure the measures are followed?
Great. So a couple things. I'll speak that generally what the board sees is that if you go back to Tracy's slide on the legal tools in FERPA, if you follow those legal tools and you implement practice changes such as sediment in a legal environment, we actually see pretty high compliance with the legal requirements in BC. Now, we undertake periodic audits to make sure that's happening, but we actually feel if you use the legal tools that are available, you generally get pretty good compliance by licensees around those practice requirements. So that's a general response.
Thanks, Kevin. One of our attendees today asks, specific to Vancouver Island, 2/3 of our watershed are private managed forest land. Why can we not discuss both acts together?
Well, it's interesting, as the reader, so whoever submitted that question probably knows that private forest managed land is not managed under the Forest and Range Practices Act, which only applies to Crown Forest lands or a small amount of private lands and tree farm licenses and so on. There is a separate regulation, Private Forest Managed Lands Act, if my title's correct, which does set some standards. And all I can say is that the province did undertake a review of the standards on private forest managed land a couple of years back, and I think the proper place is to direct it to the Private Forest Managed Land Council and to the province through that review if they have concerns about private forest managed land.
Thanks, Kevin. Through the thought exchange that was sent out with everybody's registration, we've received a question here. Who monitors what is happening out in our forests? Not enough people hired to monitor and hold the forest companies accountable.
I'll start and then I'm going to ask Tracy to talk a little bit about monitoring as well. But I'll say, there's obviously lots of people are concerned about the level of monitoring. I'll say there are kind of 2 parts. One is the we'll call the enforcement monitoring, compliance monitoring. For anyone who's interested, we did a report on that about 3 years ago, and we definitely have raised the view that we need to see a robust compliance and monitoring program. And the province has taken some steps to kind of ease back in or make sure that forestry remains a priority for its compliance staff. So I'll just say there's that issue. But second is who's actually, that's whether you're enforcing the regulations, but how effective are they? And that's this world of emerging effectiveness monitoring on the ground and cumulative effects monitoring. And there's a ton of evolution to BC's programs in the past 10 years that we partly described in that report. But I'll ask Tracy just to maybe hit on a couple things that we emphasize where there has been some changes and I think some good things that we want to rely on and use.
Sure. So one of the programs we highlight in the report is the cumulative effects framework. And so, we're starting to see the results of those monitoring efforts published online, and it sounds like there's more to come in the short term. So stay tuned for that. But between the cumulative effects stuff that's not only happening through the province, but through some of these environmental stewardship initiative programs or the collaborative stewardship models that are, I think, primarily going on more in like the northeast and the north part of the province in the Skeena area. They're providing really valuable information that I think is going to be essential as we roll out through forest landscape planning to inform that tactical level of planning and be able to really focus in on areas that we need more information on, that are at higher risk, and those can be paid more attention to. But beyond that, FREP's been in place for quite a long time, and as we showed today, we're starting to get some really good results from some of those monitoring programs. So I encourage people to keep paying attention to that. There's a lot of really good reports being published and that have a lot of good information. And then, I think the obvious is the Forest Practices Board. I mean, we're out there as well through our audit programs and through our public complaints program. So reading our complaint investigations will help to point to areas where we're still seeing weakness in effectiveness of forest practices, especially when we're seeing compliant practices, which is quite often the case. So I think those are all good sources.
I'll just add one more, because I think it's a really question on a lot of people's minds, but there's also been a significant growth in the Guardian programs with Indigenous peoples, and significant federal funding, a lot of effort by Indigenous people trying to address that concern. And those programs are sometimes joint with the ministry. We've heard of some good programs where they're out with CNE staff, or they're actually working with ministry staff. So there's been a surge in the kind of boots on the ground monitoring that I think the questioner was getting at. And as Tracy said, I think you're going to start to see more results coming from those various programs that were initiated over the past 2 to 5 years. And we're paying attention to it, and I encourage everyone else to pay attention to them.
Thanks, Kevin and Tracy. My next question is, how should the impacts of other industries be incorporated?
Oh boy, the big one. The board did a report on cumulative effects from all sectors back in 2010 and called for improved management by the province of the cumulative effects of all industrial development, of all developments, period. And we still believe that's a principle. One thing we alluded to in the report that, we're not going to tell government how to do that, but we sort of indicate that what the questioner has asked for is necessary. There's a couple ways they can do that. One is certainly even in just the forestry assessments, the footprint of other development is considered when you undertake a cumulative effects assessment, for example, on a watershed. Any kind of thing that cuts down a tree is part of the assessment phase of figuring out what the cumulative effects are. So that's a positive step of applying, for example, the professional guidelines. But there's also other tools government will need to bring to bear. So we highlight, for example, that the Oil and Gas Activities Act actually has the capability of bringing in parallel requirements to the Forest and Range Practices Act. So that's one way that government could basically bring in parallel requirements for multiple industries. But I think it's a great question, and there's still more conversation to be had about how you deal with the complexity of bringing in all the different activities on the land base.
This kind of expands a little bit on that, Kevin. This next question asks how development within local municipalities can be included into cumulative effects assessment on a watershed.
Yeah, I think it's a variation on that theme, which is if the municipalities, for example, private land development, that can affect your watershed. It can affect paving's actually really bad for watershed integrity, and we know that we're seeing urban development, and that's part of the reality in some areas of the province. So that needs to be part of that assessment. I think the second piece is that we know there are going to be complex watersheds where the forestry issues may not actually be the dominant or single issue. And so Tracy earlier pointed out that there are pilot projects under what's known as the Water Sustainability Act, which can use tools under the Water Sustainability Act. And those tools essentially deal with water, but can also talk about and provide direction to development outside the actual water column, i.e. management of the watershed and management activities in a watershed. And they can apply to private land. So there is one of the pilots in the province is dealing with primarily private land. And so they're going to be experimenting with how tools under the Water Sustainability Act can direct all activities, including private land development.
Thank you. Our next question, when discussing a risk-based approach, it is difficult when led from a forestry perspective. Risk is different for different groups, such as water purveyors or fisheries. What can be done to define risk to suit watershed health?
Well, I think that there's no one answer for all watersheds, right? I think it's the first step is really to understand the watersheds that you're trying to manage. And this is where we point to where, like taking the context of, say, a timber supply area where you have multiple licensees operating within the same land base. Licensee number one might consider risk differently than licensee number two. And this is why we state in the report, and we believe that it's government's role to set those desired outcomes. How much risk is acceptable? And that's not going to be the same answer everywhere, which is why we're suggesting that there's likely a flexible approach like that can be applied differently in different places to try to address this issue, but that sets a standard that is consistent for all practitioners and licensees operating within the same watershed. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah.
My next one is, you have stated the importance of managing for sediment. What about the effects of forest cover removal related to climate change and value of old growth health in forests?
That's tied up in the assessment of cumulative effects. I mean, the first thing is the effect of forest cover removal is going to depend on the ecosystem. So it really needs to be assessed on a case, on an ecosystem basis. Some ecosystems will have disturbance and removal of forest cover at a certain level as part of the natural disturbance regime. And so that'll create a different ecosystem dynamic than others that might be more stable and there will be less impact. So you really need to assess the ecosystem locally. And then that's really where one of the great things we've developed in BC is a much stronger understanding of which changes to forest cover have which changes on the hydrograph. And it's a very sophisticated science today compared to what it was 25 years ago, where it's just some pretty crude numbers. They have a lot better ability to assess, for example, I'm super intrigued by this, the influence of aspects. So harvesting on a north aspect will have a very different impact on the rate of snow melt than harvesting on a south or a west facing aspect. And harvesting at a certain elevation where that's where the snow is coming off when the flood happens is very different than harvesting and removing forest cover at a different elevation that is not timed at the same time as the hydrograph is changing or the floods are happening. So that's where you really, that ability to understand that impact is part of that cumulative effects assessment and generally is assessed in a watershed assessment process.
Thanks, Kevin. Were culverts included in the sedimentation review? Culvert size and ditch and culvert maintenance are often where issues.
Yes, definitely our staff looked at that in the fish report. And I mean, there's two parts. One is culverts are partly for a different FPB requirement, which is just maintain natural drainage patterns, and they have to do that. There's a pretty clear legal requirement there, which is actually much more easily enforceable than the current gap we see in FPB around sediment. So yes, we did look at it. We did not identify a systemic issue with culvert sizing per se, I think was one of the questions. But I would say, and we're looking at the work, back to the climate change, there's a ton of knowledge that you're going to need to at least consider whether you need to upsize your culverts and other structures. There's actually work coming out of the ministry and coming out of the various technical advisors, FP Innovations and so on, that is helping give advice to forest professionals on how they should consider climate change, potentially higher changes to the hydrograph, more water in designing their current culverts and bridges. So you're seeing that already trickle down to forest professionals. The consideration of larger culverts is in play.
This next question seems to build on that a little bit. It asks, are these reports and investigations looking at potential sedimentation from non-fish bearing stream harvest practices?
Yes. The answer is yes. We did look at the potential for sediment generation in a watershed. I don't think there's any watersheds, not many in BC, that aren't fish bearing eventually. So we looked at it on a watershed scale.
Thank you. What level of engagement with Indigenous nations are in progress in light of UNDRIP and BC's reconciliation effort?
Oh boy, I'm going to speak to that briefly for the board. First, I know the province has a number of initiatives underway, and I couldn't give justice to it either in what's happening or what should be happening, which I think is part of the question. But I'll say the board has also identified that we need to increase our level of engagement with Indigenous people. We started down a path a few years ago with building an Indigenous strategy. We consulted with some Indigenous experts, advisors who have worked with or for the board in the past, and got some advice on steps that we need to take ourselves. And specifically, we're starting to engage communities much more when we have either an audit or a complaint in their community, And we're starting to get some interesting uptake where communities are picking up the phone and calling us and saying, we really want to know more about what you do, and here's the values that we see. So the board is improving our game, and we're also going to start to take a deeper approach to Indigenous engagement in the development of some of our coming reports. So stay tuned for that. But I think it's a place where we all have work to do, and we're trying to move ahead on that as well. And I'll say water is super important value for Indigenous communities. We point that out in the report. I think I've heard different things from different folks around the Indigenous priority province-wide. Of course, it's different for every community, but water is among either the top or the next to the top values that First Nations have expressed concern about with respect to forest management. And that's why there's a lot of emphasis on the First Nation Fisheries Council and their Water for Fish initiative and local initiatives with Indigenous communities. The 2 land use planning modernization projects that Tracy mentioned are co-developed with Indigenous communities, one in the Nicola and one in the Wet'suwet'en Upper Bulkley Northeast watershed. So yeah, there's a lot of going on around water, sustainability, forest practices with Indigenous people.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions here that I'm going to combine. Has there been an acceptance of the Community Watershed Report recommendations from 2014? And how confident are you that the province will accept and implement these recommendations?
Partial. The recommendations, I can't spool off the top of my head, but they were not fully endorsed. In particular, the board at the time recommended source water protection be advanced. And source water protection is partly related to that issue we raised around sediment. And that has subsequently, that issue of source water protection was subsequently echoed in an Auditor General's report, which now I think is about 18 months old. And the province, that report identified a whole series of measures that are needed to strengthen protection of water in community watersheds, including application of the Drinking Water Protection Act and interagency stuff. So I'll just say there's a ton of activity going on there. And our understanding is the province generally accepted the recommendations from the Auditor General and is still working on how to implement them. So I'd say stay tuned on that.
Sure. If a community is investigating watershed restoration, can we provide pointers to the watershed restoration checks and guidelines? For example, the riparian area condition and the stream channel condition.
I would say yes. There is a lot of resources available around kind of first how you look at watersheds to assess whether or not they need restoration. I just want to say sometimes it's not a good idea to go on restore because that can cause as much damage as what you're fixing. So there's a fairly rigorous process that needs to be gone through to plan restoration activities, and there is a ton of guidance available out there. In terms of what the board sees, if anyone has specific questions on that, just contact us because we've got one of our investigators who knows a ton about this stuff, and I'd put them in touch with that person.
As our final question for you too, can you give us some practical directive measures whereby we can get some of your recommendations enacted into law, like who to write to, etc.?
So the first and most obvious is that I mentioned at the start that the province actually has a public discussion period open right now for the watershed security strategy. I believe if you go to the Ministry of Environment Climate Change Strategies website, there is a public engagement site or Engage BC. So go to that and you can respond to their public discussion paper or just put in your own thoughts on what watershed security means to you and what you think the priorities should be. So that's the first one. The second one is we mentioned sort of modernization of forestry legislation that's ongoing, and in particular things like sediment. That will be, through the Ministry of Forests as of April 1st that will be responsible for those changes. So write to the ministry and, give them your thoughts on what you should do, on what they should do.
Thanks very much. This concludes our available time today. As a last reminder, there will be a brief survey pop up as this webinar ends. In the next couple of days, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the video of this webinar. And if you missed that exit survey, it'll be there too. I've displayed on your screen a few ways you can connect with us. Thank you for joining the Forest Practices Board for improving forest practices to protect water. Thank you.